I am Jordan Brown. I'm one of the grad student coordinators for the ARF Brown Bag series here. If anybody has any announcements before or after the talk, do post that in the YouTube chat and I will convey those. The only one that I've got at the top of the hour here is that our next Brown Bag next week is going to be with our very own recent graduate, David Hyde, who will be talking about the wide and wild world of CRM consulting. So he's been doing a lot of work in cultural resource management. I'm excited to hear about that. So we'll begin today with a land acknowledgement modeled on that, developed by the Native American Student Development Office in partnership with the Ohlone tribe. We consider this a working formulation to be replaced with language reflecting the particular position of the ARF community, which will be developed in collaboration with appropriate stakeholders. We're working on that. The archaeological research facility sits on the territory of Huichun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. We hereby acknowledge that this land remains of great importance to the Ohlone people, that every member of the ARF community benefits from the continued occupation of this land, and that it is our responsibility to support Indigenous sovereignty and hold the University of California accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. So this week, we have Alyssa Scott on screen here today, who is a historical archaeologist and also works on the archaeologies of institutions, healthcare, the built environment, 19th and 20th centuries, and is interested in the archaeology of the contemporary material culture and processes of identification, such as gender, race, disability, and age. She'll be talking today about some of these issues in relation to tuberculosis sanitariums in 20th century California. So close to home, both spatially and temporally. And I'm very excited to hear this talk because, in fact, I got to hear about this research in an earlier stage in my very first archaeology course I took here at Berkeley. So that was, in a sense, Alyssa's research was formative to my introduction to the Berkeley archaeology community. So without any further ado, we will hear from Alyssa for archaeology at the Weimar Joint Sanatorium for tuberculosis. If you've got questions, please do paste them into the YouTube chat and I will ask them after the talk. Take it away.
Thank you very much, and thanks for allowing me to speak today. So I'll be talking about the Weimar Joint Sanatorium for tuberculosis, and I've been, as part of my dissertation fieldwork, I've been doing, I've been doing fieldwork, archival research, and oral histories at the site of the sanatorium. And I'm going to discuss some of the results of that work today and some ongoing research. So tuberculosis has had a pervasive impact on everyday life and daily practices. In the past, and everyday objects such as ceramic dishes, pipes, window glass, and fences are connected to ideas about health in the body. Pedestrian survey, mapping, geophysical survey at the site of the Weimar Joint Sanatorium has revealed remnants of daily life and everyday objects that form part of everyday life at the sanatorium. So this presentation examines kind of the dynamic intersection between disease, everyday practices, the creation of norms, and the implications for social memory and visibility of disease epidemics. I'll relate these issues to contemporary processes of identification and inequality in the health landscape today, and I'll, with particular focus on the intersection between race, gender, and disability, and tuberculosis sanatorium institutionalization. So before I go on, this photo on the slide was the nurses building at the Weimar Joint Sanatorium. And as I'll talk about later, it has a lot of balconies, a lot of windows, which are typical and kind of part of the health ideology behind TB sanatoriums and health in general at that time. Okay, so in this presentation, I just want to start out by saying that I will discuss topics such as institutionalization, ableism, racism, health disparities, and other forms of discrimination, which could be upsetting for some people. I also think it's important to realize to recognize too as well, since we are in the midst of a pandemic too, and I'll be talking about disease. I just want to recognize that a number of people have personal experiences or might be undergoing grief, and just to kind of reflect on that as well. And there's a number of differences between TB and COVID, but I think it's important. It's something I've been reflecting on throughout this last year, as well as all the other things that have been going on to this year. Also mention too that this project does not involve excavation of burials, and when will mention the word bodies or body, I'm talking about this in the as far as in body experiences in more of like a theoretical sense, not as actual bodies. And when I'm talking about health, I'll be mainly talking about the artifacts and the space and the like buildings surrounded in landscape. And I guess one last note too is that I'll be when I'm talking about disability, I'll be using the word disabled persons to indicate, because I'll be talking about it in terms of identity and the intersection with other forms of identification. And just the last also note, I think it's important, is that I'm of course not a doctor or a health professional too. So if you have any questions about any of that, refer to actual doctors or official sources. Okay, so the overview of so first I'll give a quick overview. So I'll give a quick background to TB Sanatorium and TB and some of my research questions into these types of institutions. I will orient my research. I'll quickly go over some of the methods used and then present some of the perspectives I've gained and highlight some different types of material culture, which I've been thinking through. Today, I'll focus mainly on two types. I'm going to focus on pipes, like water and sewer pipes, the sanatorium, and chain link fences, but I'll kind of briefly touch over some of the other types that I've been thinking through as part of this project. And photo here shows a dormitory building at the sanatorium. Okay, so tuberculosis is a respiratory disease mainly, although it can affect other parts of the body. It's usually spread through coughing or speaking. The disease there are antibiotics to treat the disease since the 1940s. So it is there are antibiotic resistant strains, but most cases it is curable. So the disease, it can go into latency for many years, but it's also still one of the major killers globally, and it's one of the top 10 killers worldwide to this day, regardless of the fact that there has been a treatment for it since the mid 20th century. So, oh no, okay, so this photo is also one of the dormitory buildings at the sanatorium. Okay, so some background on TB sanatoria. Sanatoria were long-term residential hospitals where people suffering from tuberculosis would stay for a period of time in hopes of recovering. A person would stay would range from a few weeks or years, and the sanatorium treatment focused on rest, fresh air, or high altitude, a special diet, and sunlight. Um, although, so that the sanatorium period was mainly between the early 1900s through the 1940s, before antibiotics, so it was after germ theory. So they knew that it was caused by um, bacterium, but they didn't yet have an effective treatment. They didn't have antibiotics. So the idea behind it was generally to kind of boost the immune system um, in order for people to be able to fight off the infection. Although most sanatoria were public or charitable, some sanatoria were public or charitable institutions, most of them um, cost a lot of money. So this one that I'll be discussing today, I'll discuss in relation to some of those others, but also I want to keep in mind that this is a public one and isn't necessarily representative of a lot of the cases of these sanatoria. And there is kind of a very diverse health landscape of private institutions and public institutions as well. Okay, so again, this is another one of the sanatorium dormitories shown in this photo. It has big windows, um, so which will be common throughout pretty much all of the photos that you'll see. But I just thought I'd put quite a lot of them up here so you kind of get a sense of what is typical of the buildings at this sort of place. Okay, so my main field site is the Weimar Joint Sanatorium. It opened in 1919 and was jointly operated by a group of counties in California. Um, during its existence, it was operated by up to 15 counties in northern and central California, although several joined or left at different periods, so that changed over the history of the sanatorium. It was um, built for indigent patients who were unable to pay for treatment elsewhere, and at its peak, it housed almost 500 patients. Um, the Bureau of Indian Affairs built a Native American building at the sanatorium in the 1930s. Um, and um, so people from this, the patients who were here would have been from all over California. Um, so after the 1940s, it changed focus and eventually became a general medical center, although it still had a focus on chest and lung issues. And in 1975, after it closed in the early 70s, it became Hope Village, which is a relocation center for Vietnamese refugees. And in 1977, the property was bought by Seventh-day Adventist group and became the Weimar Institution, which is what it is today. So this is another photo of one of the dormitory buildings, again, showing you lots of windows. These are south-facing windows, too, for lots of sunlight. Okay, so TB and material culture. So similarly in the ways that the current pandemic has caused people to reconfigure daily life, disease in the past also had disease and health in the body in the past is also connected to material culture. The TB sanatorium treatment applied not only to sanatoria, but also aligned with a broader ideology surrounding health, which was embedded and materialized in many aspects of material culture in the built environment. So examples of what you can think or that are apparent nowadays are, of course, masks and gloves. But you could also think about cleaning um, supplies, exercise equipment. Even at the time, the glaze on the bottom of ceramics, the ceramics companies were arguing that that was more sanitary because you would stack plates and it was less likely to have dirt at the bottom of it. So it really does actually, when you infiltrate, ideas of health in the body do actually infiltrate all um, kind of aspects of material culture. Um, so at the time, some examples that were TB specific were windows became more popular, which I've shown a lot of, and buildings also we're trying to incorporate more sunlight. So balconies and solaria started being built not only in institutions like what I'll discuss today, but also in homes. Parks were often referred to as the lungs of the city, um, and there was a greater movement to having outdoor areas where people could be outside and have access to fresh air. Okay, so since sunlight and TB were part of the cure for since sunlight and fresh air were part of the treatment for TB, the site was kind of built around this treatment in a lot of ways. So this shows a map of the site, and I know you might be a little too small to see, but some of the yellow buildings are male patient dorms. The green ones are female dorms. The red could be are buildings used by either, um, and it's built up on a hill, um, again for sunlight, and they're all kind of aligned on this slope. Um, they also had a dairy up in the top left corner, so they're trying to, which comes into a special diet. At the time, they thought that um, lots of milk products were good for TB, so um, they had dairy on site. Um, but there are a number of different ways in which the treatment of the TB um, kind of got built into the site. Um, you can also see kind of reflection. TB was stigmatized with a number at the time with poverty, but also with moral overtones in some ways. So at the time, by some estimates, there are actually more women with TB than men, but usually fewer female applicants at the sanatorium. So that reflects the fact that there is more buildings. Is that there was specific gendered spaces at the sanatorium. Okay, so archaeologies of institutions often focus on a Foucauldian framework in which institutions seek to control behaviors or bodies through the architecture or practices. Um, the or surveillance. So example of this is this photo that I've showed, which is a drawing of Jeremy Bentham's panopticon. And this shows an example of surveillance. So this was built around, it was a prison designed that wasn't actually ever built, but it was designed to have, so that inmates would be seen all the time. And then if they knew that they were being surveilled, then they were supposedly would, um, that would work to control their behavior. So this is one way in which surveillance can be built. It can be embedded in the built environment. Other contemporary examples of the way that this could be thought of would be, for instance, like fake security cameras, in which even if nobody's actually watching, um, it would control a person's behavior just if they thought that they were being watched. So archaeologies of institutions often focus on identifying ways, modes of surveillance, and also resistance within the sanatorium through daily practices. Irving Goffin, who focuses on asylums, wrote about total institutions, and he argued that people within the sanatorium, patients within the sanatorium, would practice resistance through everyday practices. And that also through in the sanatorium, the institutions would replace personal belongings with clothing or institutional items, which was supposed to encourage a transformation of self. So these ideas get reflected in a lot of archaeologies of institutions, which often seek to look for barriers. So one of Goffman's criteria for a total institution or an institution that controls would be barriers such as fences, walls, or geographic isolation. And then also looking for forms of material culture in which the people within the sanatorium might show resistance. Okay, so that's the framework that I started out with, but also I want to expand this to other thoughts, kind of beyond institutions as far as theorizing everyday life. And there's a lot of, most archaeological projects will focus on some aspects of everyday life or daily life. So I won't go over all of this. There's of course been a lot in historical archaeology, particular James Deet's book, Small Things Forgotten, in which he positions historical archaeology as the study of kind of remnants of daily life, which are otherwise forgotten or overlooked in the historical record. And when I'm focusing on I've chosen some forms of material cultures such as chain link fences, sewer pipes, which haven't been largely studied in historical archaeology yet. And I think so it's focused on kind of a process of overlooking, but societally, but also in archaeology as well. And I'll talk about a little bit that more. But I also want to position kind of the thinking about the ways that material culture is visibilized, also in terms of Anna Singh's book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, in which she describes the way that at first she found the Masuki mushrooms to be an acquired taste, and then eventually got to like them. But artifacts, I think, also have meaning that is dependent upon temporal context associations. And this forms part of a larger assemblage. And this has effect on the visibility of daily objects, including to archaeologists who form part of this assemblage, which is true for me because I didn't necessarily. So I would not originally. I was looking originally. I tended to look at barriers and pathways and fences, but I think otherwise would not have thought fully to think about sewer pipes, or which are usually the thing that's in the way of the other archaeology when you're looking at geophysics. Um, but so I think throughout this has kind of been a transformation as far as looking at the process has led me to look at some other forms of material culture which I wouldn't necessarily have thought of otherwise. So in this project, I have focused on aspects of contemporary material culture which are often overlooked or forgotten in archaeological studies. And my research is influenced by both queer theory and crypt theory, in that they critique normativity and their discussion of identification. I also draw on psychoanalytic reading in that things that are forgotten, for example, forgotten word or phrase, are not necessarily forgotten or overlooked because they are unimportant, but that they also indicate kind of either a much larger process, either of ordering or of an assemblage, which continue to be, which it continues to be a part of. And in this, normativity facilitates forgetting, which can obscure structures of power, ideologies, or social structures for objects that are continue to be mundane in contemporary culture. So chain link fences are something that you see every day. Um, Water and sewer pipes are something that you don't see every day, but you use that every day. So beyond kind of institutions, these aren't really material that is institutionally specific, but can also be thought of as far beyond the bounds of the site. Okay. So the 4 types that I'm focusing on, again, are window glass, chain link fences, water and sewer pipes, and ceramic dishes. And today I'll talk mainly about water and sewer pipes. I'll go over some of the geophysical studies that I conducted at the site. And I'll talk a little about chain link fences. But I won't go into the other 2 in as much depth. So my research questions are: how are emerging narratives about disease in the body communicated through material culture and the built environment? How are people in the past and the present affected by these narratives about health, ideas about health, the body, and disability? And how do these narratives result in stigma, discrimination, privilege, or health disparities? So in 2017, 2018, I undertook a minimally invasive fieldwork study of the site of the Weimar Joint Sanatorium. I used a variety of low impact fieldwork methods, including mapping, pedestrian survey, magnetometer survey, and ground penetrating radar. Additionally, I've been doing archival research and oral histories throughout the project. And there's a very extensive archive, a set of archival sources associated with the site. So here's a photo of one of the field students practicing with the magnetometer. And this shows kind of the extent of the places that we were able to do the magnetometer survey. You'll notice a lot of times they're pretty close to the buildings, but it still works out. We still got good results. Okay, so this is the geophysics, and you'll see Lucy Gill and Nick Perez, who are there on the field site with me doing that. And again, so this is pretty heavily landscaped over in sort of the campus. I'll show an aerial photo later. There's also a lot of like land around it, but a lot of that wasn't conducive to geophysical survey due to vegetation, and also probably not places where I was likely to find much. So the things that we were looking for through this, there were tents on the sanatorium. So I was hoping to see if there were any places where I could find the compacted soil, earth, which the GPR measures areas of, it can detect areas of compaction. I was also looking for other sorts of pathways or other structures that and landscaping features. So there's a number of things as far as there was a miniature golf course on the sanatorium, and there are a number of other landscaping features which actually tie into the treatment of tuberculosis. Not miniature golf specifically, but outdoor spaces and outdoor recreation. Okay, so this is an example of kind of one of the areas that we did, and this shows the magnetometer survey. So this is when I I reference how I've depicted, so this shows like cement pathway. So it has a kind of pale gray perspective. The magnetometer measures differences in the Earth's magnetic field. So this black and white pattern here is the segments of a pipe. They have a positive and negative end. So this is very clearly a metal pipe. And other things like this could also be ceramic. So the ones that aren't clearly metal pipe as a linear feature could be ceramic or PVC pipe. And then I combine those with also the GPR to kind of deduce what those are, because the GPR can give an indication of with parabolic fitting, like how big the feature is, whether it's a flat thing or kind of a more rounded thing to some extent. So these are some of the features. And there's also a linear feature as well, and like stone wall. This is one that I could see from the surface, so it was a good example for identifying features in other parts of the site. Okay, so I didn't originally plan on studying sewer pipes, but and water pipes on the site, but there's actually quite a lot, and the fact is that in archaeology, I think it's important to kind of go with what you find, and there's actually quite a lot you can see. So it's a 20th century. So they tie into the sanitary movement in the mid-19th century. The round pipes and having an enclosed like sanitary system, sewer system dates to the 19th century. And so it's or the late 19th century in most places. So it's kind of a artifact that ties into some of the larger like sanitary movement. The sewer pipes and water pipes can also give a bunch of indications as far as what the relationship is between the site and the rest of the landscape. The sanatorium, they did it all on site, so it was just kind of unique. So it wasn't like feeding into another like larger city system. There's also another other landscape features as far as at the sanitarium. I'll talk about. There was a number of issues as far as they were constantly replacing them because there were concerns due to sanitation, and there were also constantly having to update the fire system. They had a few buildings that burnt down throughout the history of it, and it's also in California in the foothills in Placer County, which, if you know nowadays, it's California is always a high fire risk, and they're all wood buildings. Okay, so this is a quote from from somebody who was for Ward, who was instrumental in kind of rethinking the sanitation and the sanitary sewer, which is kind of what people use nowadays, as opposed to having like a drain. And he specifically, as you can see from this quote, which I won't read out, he kind of re-envisioned the city, and these are primarily in urban places. So you re-envisioned the city as kind of a human circulatory system, and the sewer systems were going to be you'd have a pump, and that was going to be the part at the heart, and it was going to circulate waste from the city into the rural areas, where it was going to be cleaned agriculturally and then sent back as it, and then like fed into like the food. So it was going to be incorporated into agriculture, and then the agriculture was going to produce food for the city. So this it tends to be, even to this day, this metaphor for the body and pipes and the water system um, tends to get recirculated in contemporary articles, and as a metaphor that's pretty commonly used. And it also goes along with other ones I mentioned earlier, the parks as lungs metaphor, in which the city, and in this case, the sanatorium is not a city, but it was pretty much like a small town. They were doing everything that they're producing their own food there. They were um, they had a radio station, or a radio broadcast. I don't know if it was a full station, but they had all sorts of different things. There was kind of like a small town. So this metaphor um, gets used to describe the system, which is then used to characterize cities and the relationship between cities and the rural areas. Oh, so and this picture is not from the Weimar Sanatorium, but it's actually from the Arequipa Sanatorium. It's a picture from a collection of 13 newspaper pictures, and it's interesting because this one of the newspaper reporter comes to go see the sanatorium, and of the 13 pictures that they took, one of them she's pointing to the drains as being a really important part of the sanatorium. Um, so you can see at this point it was also just that was something that they're showing, being that we have good sanitation here. Okay, so this also focuses on kind of a larger movement, and this word sanitary. This is a Google Ngrams graph, and it shows that sanitary is actually peaks right around the time that the sanatorium, the Weimar Joint Sanatorium, and other sanatoriums were being built. There's and it gets reused in all sorts of ways. So if you are familiar with cans, the sanitary seam on cans is also the official name for like a little seam on cans. So it's really getting incorporated into a lot of different aspects of life at that time. And it's also related, of course, to the word sanatorium or sanitarium, which is the other spelling of the word. And those words often get used interchangeably at that time. They have different meanings today depending on who you ask. But at that time, so I'll use the word sanatorium because that was the word used at the Weimar Joint Sanatorium or Sanatorium. Um, but that kind of ties into this larger movement. Okay, so this one, I'll just show so these are some of my geophysics. These are some of the pipes. I think some of these are probably water pipes compared with the other, well, various other sources of information. But this kind of gives an example of the sort of results from the survey, where these are all over top of each other. So so there are, obviously these linear things are probably pipes, but there's also, if you see this denser area, the blues are denser areas. I think this area was on top of a playground. So there are some landscaping features probably associated with that. And there was some terracing. So there's also, you could see the remnants of a wall later. So I think it extends probably here. And then there's some denser areas. I can see in the profile, a lot of these tend to be, I think, flat pieces of cement, which could be bases or part of a old pathway. It's not really possible to know for sure a lot of these without excavation, but that is some of the sort of things that you'll see on some of these on some of the results of this. Okay. Um, okay, so part of the reason that I'm discussing this is that it also formed a really a kind of a point of contention between the sanatorium and the larger community, well, and the rest of California. There are a number of grand jury reports to do with the sanatorium. Um, the sanatorium was periodically inspected by county grand juries, which routinely inspect um, usually prisons, hospitals, and other facilities. So these are routine inspections. And they're usually made up of, in this case, they're made up of members of each of the counties who form part of the sanatorium, the group that was running the sanatorium. So they're people from all over California. And at some point too, they would often focus on different aspects of the sanatorium. So in this point, they said, so there's an interesting case in the 1930s where specifically they published the reports in the local newspaper, and they were concerned that the sanatorium sewage was leaking into the creek that would then go into summer homes and recreation centers. Um, it's I'm I can't necessarily I can't judge whether it was or not the sanatorium board meeting notes. The sanatorium board didn't believe that it was, and that they had it inspected by the California by the state, but as they would normally, but they did make changes. But it did kind of form a point of contention, um, which is also kind of at this point also focused, interestingly, on kind of a class. Uh, there's some interesting, like, so they're also concerned that they it wasn't necessarily concerned about like people living in the area, but more concerned about like summer homes. So there's some other economic interests at play to this, which the sanatorium, which is often, TB was often, as I said earlier, stigmatized with like urban poverty. Um, some of the this becomes kind of a point of contention. Um, Okay, so I'm gonna head on through because I'm running out of time. So this kind of ties into other larger processes of identification. And I want to think about this also as far as the patients, like a relationship with the larger like the cities in that which they came from. Um, and so a lot of times, because this isn't, I want to kind of expand beyond the actual bounds of the sanatorium site to actually look at kind of the larger influences. Um, the tuberculosis at that time was considered by a lot of people as a disability because it was a long, slow disease. It would go into latency, but people would often, but it could come back. And while it's in latency, it was not thought to be contagious, so people would, go on with their normal lives, but weren't necessarily. It was thought that if you worked too hard, then that would trigger a reoccurrence. It would cause it to come back, and it would cause people to get active TB again. So there's a push by a group led by a former Weimar Sanatorium patient in the 1930s in connection to also a group of disabled people who were at that time trying to push through legislation, or trying to support legislation in California that would um, provide funding for people to stay home or to do projects, um, and it, to support themselves when they weren't contagious, but didn't need to be in the sanatorium. Um, and it ultimately failed. Um, but I think this is kind of interesting because some of the patients, it kind of speaks to a larger issue in that often people would go to the sanatorium, and that patients who are, especially later on in years, or later on in the sanatorium time, and this is at like the peak of the 1930s Great Depression as well. So a lot of times patients were homeless, um, and didn't necessarily have any place to go after the sanatorium. So um, I think comparing it to the larger landscape also looks at the fact that some of the patients um, weren't necessarily able to, when they were returned to they would end up in the sanatorium, not necessarily because of like gates or fences or rules at the sanatorium, but they would end up in the sanatorium because they had left the sanatorium and then couldn't receive access to healthcare, or couldn't receive access to basic needs, in which would cause a reoccurrence, and then they would end up back at the sanatorium, or they couldn't necessarily leave in the first place because they didn't have a home to return to. The sanatorium did have, somebody did actually start a um, place in Sacramento for people to transition back after leaving the sanitarium, especially in the 50s, and later, that there is greater awareness that people here, that patients there would have a lot of difficulty actually finding jobs afterwards. So there's a greater push for that. But I think it's important to kind of think about some of these issues and some of the larger things, because those are also something that was affecting and also intersects with poverty and a larger landscape in California. Okay, so another kind of result of this too, and I'm actually, um, so I'll come back to this a second. So I want to, so this is a can scatter this is on the outskirts of the sanatorium. So again, like kind of looking beyond the main campus, some of the geophysics were mainly focused on the campus area, but pedestrian survey, I looked kind of beyond the main area, and there's also a can scatter. Um, and these are from the period in which, I think it's roughly 1940s. um, it's outside of not in the cemetery, but outside of the cemetery. Um, and it is all mainly individual size, so probably not like from a big institution. I would expect there to be larger sized cans. So it could very well have been somebody living outside of the sanatorium. Can scatters are common in the 1930s, but it it kind of speaks to a larger like landscape, um, of it, kind of beyond actually just being inside of the buildings. Okay, so the last kind of thing that I'll touch upon are chain link fences. Whoop. Um, so they are physically, you can see through them. You could interpret this as a form of surveillance, and I think this also. But the fence of the sanatorium. There's a fence put up in the 1940s. There's a gate put up earlier in 1921, and some of these actually seem to coincide with times in which the sanatorium came under scrutiny from um, from the outside. And in one case, the sanatorium entrance gate. In the 20s, there was an incident where San Francisco was going to join the sanatorium, potentially San Francisco County, um, and they decided not to ultimately, but somebody, and it ultimately is unclear to me who exactly. The newspapers were trying to figure it out, and the report was never actually, I couldn't find an actual copy of the report. Um, Probably because it ended up being contentious. But somebody seems to have hired a private detective in the 1920s to go into the sanatorium, um, and he lived there for about 3 weeks. Um, and as the newspapers reported it, he said that he gave a bad report of the sanatorium. But the accusation was mainly, actually, a lot of it was actually focused not on the sanatorium, although he did say that, the food was bad, and stuff like that. And he said but he also, a lot of it quote accused the patients of running wild in the forest, and quote having orgies. So there was, which is very strong language for the 1920s. Um, that was the word used in the newspapers. So this one is problematic for a number of different ways. The patients, particularly female patients at the sanatorium, came out with a statement saying, we shouldn't be accused of immorality. This is, and they denied it. Um, and I think this speaks to some of the kind of stigma at the time, against people with TB. But also at that time, there's more fences put up. There was this gate put up in 1927, and there again in there's another situation later on in which the newspapers, somebody um, accused the sanatorium. The sanatorium was being accused of, like, the patients of drinking too much in the sanatorium. And then in the 1940s, there was a chain link fence put up, supposedly for cattle, but it was a 6 foot tall, yeah, I think it was 6 foot tall chain link fence around the sanatorium perimeter. And when you think about chain link fences, they are not typically used for cattle. Um, they are expensive, particularly well, they take a lot of wire at the time in the 1940s when fencing was being rationed. Um, and all the other fences that you could use at that time, based on other records of, like, things the government was putting out as far as recommendations of, like, how to fence your cattle, were a few feet tall. They weren't a 6 foot tall chain link fence. Um, it's visible. So a lot of these would have been visible from the highway outside of the sanatorium. So it is also, I think, linking to kind of a more, it probably did ultimately restrict patients, but it also was a larger kind of performance of the sanatorium of control of the patients, which they were coming under scrutiny for. Um, yeah, okay. Okay, so I'll wrap up because I'm over time, but I'm just going to link this back to visibilities. So I think when you're thinking about borders and boundaries, there's a tendency, and this is, um, maps of pandemic or maps of disease show this a lot. That shows it, as far as countries, and national borders. But I think it's also important to think about the visibility that some of these, kind of the role of visibility in some of the focus on borders, and um, also the fact that TB is still a major killer worldwide, and largely in countries with a colonial past or history of colonialization. And so focusing on these, um, it so and throughout my experience through this project, um, unless a person like knows somebody who had TB or had some personal experience, isn't largely widely known. Um, so I would just want to reflect on the kind of the actual global visibility of the pandemic, and thinking it in a certain space, um, rather than kind of thinking through some of the larger issues. Um, so thinking beyond, critically beyond borders and boundaries, and also what role they are actually playing, um, also in normalizing equitable access to healthcare and services and equipment. Um, yeah, okay. And how this ties back to everyday life, and objects that are familiar that often go unnoticed. Okay. Thank you. Um, and I'll just put up my contact info and my website if you want to learn more about the project or contact me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Alyssa. We've got a couple of questions here in the YouTube chat. If you have a moment to answer them, I figure we started a little late, so we can go a little long. Well, there was one from Kent regarding the sewer. I think he's hopefully Kent, if you're listening out there, you can type that into the chat in full, and we will get to it. Second, so I will ask the second question first, which is from Christine Astor. How much did the March of Dimes participate or contribute to this sanatorium?
The March of Dimes. You know, I'm actually not sure. I don't know much about that. I'll have to look into it. They had various set fundraising campaigns, and I think at this time, Christmas seals was the big one. And they had like a community chest foundation. I think it was large. Their funding was largely from counties, though. It was a so I think later on they, yeah. So I'll have to look into that more.
Cool. Thank you for that. I've got another question here. Were mercury, lead, or perhaps toxic cleaning products mixed into the effluent and incinerated at the facility?
I'm not sure. So uh, it wasn't under any of the discussion in any of the newspaper archives. It was far away from the um, the the sewer area. So, but they were incinerating stuff on site. So yeah, so no historical documents that I know of at that time period mention that, but yeah, I'm not certain about that. Yeah, it didn't form part of the discourse as much.
Makes sense. Let's see. We got a question from Lori Wilkie here. Asks if you would perhaps say a few words about how thinking with crypt theory changed how you thought about materials from the site.
So thinking about thinking with crypt theory. So queer theory and crypt theory informed kind of my focus on like critique of normativity in this, and thinking about again like really kind of a questioning the assumption, well also just questioning my own normative assumptions of like what I was planning to find and what I should find at at a place like this. So I think in a lot of ways it kind of visibilized forms of material culture which I would not have thought of otherwise. And crypt theory particularly, um, which is kind of the focus queer theory, but focus more on disability and different bodies. Did actually, it like made me think critically about different forms of embodiment and kind of the different ways that that would have been constructed now and then. Um,
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. I have a question of my own, if there's nothing else popping on in chat. Just a couple of very warm thank yous for an interesting talk. Yeah, so I was really intrigued by the way you were talking about like sort of the public health knowledge at the time, and like how there was like, well, you know, it was a germ, but we didn't have the right thing to treat it. So we were going to sort of elaborate this sort of therapeutic, you know, theory of how to deal with this, this phenomenon. I was curious if, particularly in relation to like the campaign you had talked about from like the former sanatorium, uh, you know, dwellers, I guess. If there were like sort of divergent ideas about how tuberculosis worked in the medical establishment, such as it was, or and like people who are patients or people who you know had TB or something, whether inside or outside of Sanatoria. Anyway, rambling question, but I'm curious if that's something that you encountered.
yeah, so so there were different, it was pretty, there are a number of different approaches. The one focused on like sunlight and fresh air, and the one covered here with the sanatorium was kind of the most prevalent, as far as I know of, but there were also cases too, not at this one so much, but, or well, maybe at this one, I wouldn't know as far as the records, but at other sanatoriums that I've noticed that people left. There was one that said like left for a quack doctor, um, but so it's not clear exactly what that person left for or what the treatment was. But there are also at that time patent medicines being that people would go to that were supposed to treat tuberculosis, which is still being referred to in a lot of cases as consumption, which is the old word for it. There's also even some cases of like doctors trying to treat tuberculosis with psychoanalysis, which is the thing that kind of got me onto the whole like psychoanalysis, reading into some of that too, because they thought um, that would there is a kind of a they thought there was going to be a relationship between it, um so they thought that that psychoanalysis would somehow that was supposed to talking was going psychoanalysis assumes that talking is going to change your physical or your experiential or something, so they thought that that was going to treat it. And I also was interested in that because it also, the words for sanatorium nowadays tends to be associated more with asylums, um, rather than tuberculosis. So that was an interesting transition that I still don't actually have a full understanding of how that came to be. But yeah, um, so yeah, there are definitely other things that people were doing.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you for that. Let me see if we've got any more questions in the chat here. I don't see any popping up. Still, Kent's question about the sewer is very open-ended, but if you have anything you want to say about the sewer and material culture more generally, he was very pleased with your emphasis on that. I think that would. Yeah.
Could you read the question?
Such as it is.
Okay.
Kent says, I really like your emphasis on the everyday material culture. I have a question concerning the sewer.
Okay.
So it feels pretty open to you. Whatever you want to talk about.
Okay. Yeah, so it was definitely, I guess I'll raise some of the things that were interesting to me were kind of the idea, this kind of, it kind of shaped also the space as like its own town as a lot of ways, in that they were dealing with everything on site. And this was also indicative of kind of the larger relationship between the surrounding communities, and and how that formed. So I think that is kind of, and also when thinking about the body, it also, they were using metaphors of the body to describe the landscape in a way that related to health. So there was kind of this reflection of the human body in the landscape that was supposed to then reflect back on the human body, which is kind of an interesting, um, interesting metaphor, and kind of logic in there. But yeah. Okay. And
Yeah.
also, sewer pipes aren't necessarily steady. It's kind of the thing that there have been some studies of sewer pipes. There is um, uh, one in York, I think by Connolly, and, or well, he kind of talks about sanitation. I don't know if he talks about sewer pipes specifically, but also looking at kind of the way that people in slums got moved to a different area of the city. But I think also just trying to think of from some of these artifact types that we tend to look beyond, even though it's the thing that actually sticks out most in the results of this study, in the geophysics. So the pipes are the thing that I can see the best. But I was trying to look for something else. But even if I looked for something else, I'd be looking for something else in order to ask, like, I could look at the landscaping, other things I could look at, I would still have to confirm with excavation. So it seemed like I was making the results into something that wasn't actually what I was seeing. And there were results, there were clearly things there. It just wasn't necessarily the thing that I wanted. But it actually does give a lot of information about the site, and social context.
Yeah, that's a really cool perspective. I very much appreciating that. I mean, it's fun to see how such an unexpected path can get you from, like, as you say, like the most glaring pieces of evidence, but things that seem to be sort of, too large to work at the human scale of what you're interested in terms of people's, ideas about health and what to do in this particular situation they're finding themselves in. But then turn out to be, like, actually very, very evocative of those ideas. Yeah, it's. I think that quote from Ward about the sewer systems that was very, very striking. Let's see. Nothing more in the chat. I think we've done our due diligence. Thank you so much for that. That was really fun. And as I said, I'm very glad to get to see the whole life cycle here, to use another human metaphor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all the questions and for coming.
Thank you for